Good evening. My name is Colin Bailey and I'm the President and Principal here at Queen Mary, University of London. And I would like to welcome you to this fantastic university here in the heart of the East End. Very quickly about the university's got a history dating back to 1785. We are represented on campus from 162 countries. And I always say to our students and our staff, where else can you appreciate and learn from people from different backgrounds, different traditions, and different cultures? At the university, we are pushing the boundaries of research and innovation, which is having an impact locally, nationally, and internationally on the economy and on society. And I'm very pleased this evening to welcome you to the Peter Hennessy lecture. Now, the Peter Hennessy lecture is a flagship lecture through our Mile End Institute. And our Mile End Institute is looking at policy and politics, the research and how they are shaping UK life in an ever-changing environment, both in the UK and globally. Now, I'm going to ask Peter Hennessy, Lord Hennessy, to say a few words before we start and introduce our guest of honour, Lord Neil Kinnock. Now, Peter is an Attlee Professor here in our School of History at Queen Mary. He is a Senior Advisor and Patron to the Mile End Institute, and he is a firm believer of what we're trying to do here at Queen Mary in shaping so many lives of the local population, but also nationally and internationally. Peter is a crossbench peer in the House of Lords, and he was a journalist for over 20 years, working at the Times, the Financial Times, and the Economist. So without further ado, I will ask now Peter Hennessy to say a few words, and then, of course, introduce our guest of honour, Lord Neil Kinnock. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin, very much for that wonderfully warm welcome. Welcome to you all as well. It's a special evening when Neil's around. Oscar Wilde famously said, the trouble with socialism is it takes up too many evenings. But not if Neil Kinnock's there, it doesn't. I've known Neil for a long time, actually, and every conversation's a sparkle. I can remember the first conversation, Neil, you probably can't. It's the spring of '76, when Harold Wilson, to everybody's surprise, says he's standing down. There's a leadership contest, extraordinary leadership field. Tony Crossland, Roy Jenkins, Tony Benn, Michael Foot, your great friend and patron, Jim Callahan. Somebody else I've forgotten, Dennis Healy. Yeah. I mean, what a field, eh? Those were the days. But Michael didn't... But that was a bit unfortunate, wasn't it? I shouldn't have said that, really.
You left out Tony Benn.
Tony Benn, yes, yeah. Tony Benn, our friend.
No show without Tony.
Our friend. And Michael Foot, very honourable man, wonderful man, didn't want to talk to the press, didn't want to be seen to be pushing his own cause. So Neil was looking after that side of it, and we went for lunch in Bertarelli's in Charlotte Street. And we talked about R.H. Tawney, we talked about Nye Bevan, the great poet of post-war British politics. And it was a terrific time. We only talked about Michael for about 3 minutes. But that's how I remember it, the first occasion, Neil. And it's been a treat ever since when we've met. But the plan for this evening is that Neil and I will converse for about 35 to 40 minutes. Then we'll have 20 minutes or so for Q&A. Then we'll go and have a drink. So I hope that suits everybody. It is hallowed ground here, Neil, as you know, for Labour history, because it's in this very hall that Clem Attlee, on the 26th of July, 1945, the count for the Limehouse constituency was in here, as well as the Mile End seat. And it was in here that Clem Attlee realised he was going to be Prime Minister with a majority. So this is holy ground, which makes you even more welcome. Now, talking of
and envious.
And envious, yeah. Yeah. 146-seat majority, wasn't it? Let's go back to the 40s and the early 50s, the making of you as a boy and a young man in the 60s, out of the Labour movement of South Wales. Tell us about the compost that made you. I can remember those valleys. My auntie Molly had a pub in Newport, which was dry on a Sunday. So we'd drive up the valleys through your area to the Brecon Beacons and the Black Mountains. It was packed with collieries, railways, the Great Ebbw Vale Steelworks, and you came out of that formation. You're the classic product of the labour movement of the early post-war years, aren't you?
Absolutely, and indeed an inheritor and a debtor, because everything that I am and everything I've tried to contribute and believe derives from that background, packed as it was, as you say, with all the elements and evidence of heavy industry, dangerous work, coal mines, coke works, brickworks, steel works. Works were in everything. And in fact, you may be amused to know, in the house that we lived after my parents left the one room that they had when I was born, we went to a terraced house in Vale Terrace in Tredegar, which was rotten with rodents and black beetles that we used to call black pats, as in all colliery areas. But I didn't recognize that then. I was a kid of 3 or 4. And at the back of our house was the gasworks. Running outside the gasworks was the main railway line from Tredegar down to Newport. And we faced onto Teatrist Colliery, which closed in 1958. First anti-pit closure demonstration I was ever involved in. And you can imagine what the atmosphere was there. My mother, I remember, used to come to the door when I was playing in the garden and say, "Neil, come in and have your tea. It's on the table and it's getting dirty." Anyway, a little bit of mythology. But that was the background. And of course, it's an awful cliche, but it, like a lot of cliches, absolutely true. It was a truly close-knit community, and it had a real dynamic. And it expressed itself with amateur theatricals, a world-class silver band, which were world champions, still survives. I'm vice president of it. They won the world championships 2 years ago, so they're still going strong. A huge male voice choir. And on Sunday, last Sunday of the month, right throughout the winter, celebrity concerts. I heard Beniamino Gili sing in the Workmen's Hall in Tredegar. So the idea that there were these narrow valleys with narrow views is rubbish, because I think that people conscious of their disadvantage and the narrowness of their condition really very deliberately and collectively extended their horizons massively in order to nourish creativity. And in that atmosphere, of course, a huge premium was put on education, both for its fulfillment, but also as the means of escape. And that was the background without romanticizing at all, against which I grew up with a wonderfully loving and happy, hardworking family. To call them industrious would be to understate it, but they certainly were creative and imaginative as well. And that extended through the family, not just my mum and dad.
There's a great tradition of adult education. The Miners' Institute libraries were
yes.
something, weren't they? They're preserved in Swansea University. Howell Francis has preserved them. But that was entirely natural, wasn't it? You'd mix with people who were up to their eyes in Hegel.
Yeah,
I mean, we were just talking beforehand about Neil when he was a young Workers' Educational Association lecturer, ending up with men and women who'd read everything.
And understood it.
And understood it as well, yeah.
Mind you, could take a knock back. When I was doing A-levels in a very, very creamed grammar school, the Loose School, Pengham, you had to get 97% in all 3 papers to be considered. It was formerly for Monmouthshire boys, which I was, until 3 years before, it had been a scholarship system. They ended that happily. But anyway, myself and 6 other lads from Tredegar managed to satisfy the requirements and were admitted to the school that Lloyd George, in attempted flattery, called the Eton of South Wales. Anyway, I went to this school, and I wasted my time most of the time I was there. It wasn't the school's fault. It was entirely my fault. But a real premium was put on the ability to show merit and succeed, and then you could be excused for thinking you were on a kind of conveyor belt, and it would just roll along. Anyway, when I was 17, I was doing A-levels, and I joined a National Council of Labour Colleges class in the back room of the Tredegar Arms in Tredegar. And there were about 16 or 17 other people there, including, most notably, the survivors of the Query Club that had been formed by Aneurin Bevan and his contemporaries in the 1920s, and had actually run Tredegar during the general strike. They were called the Tredegar Soviet. And these were very smart guys. I think the latest any of them had been in school was at the age of 13. Distinguished even amongst this distinguished outfit was Councillor Oliver Jones, wonderful man, who comforted me once when I said that I hadn't done well in the exams and I wasn't going to be allowed to do Latin next year. He said, "Oh, don't worry about that, young Kinnock. Don't worry about that at all. It's not so long ago. There were millions of people walking around speaking fluent Latin, and they didn't have a university place among them." And that's the kind of guy he was. Anyway, being smart in this class, which I was by far the youngest member of the class, and Marcel Hausier, our lecturer from the extramural department in Cardiff University, was a wonderful teacher, great economist, and he was a Hungarian who was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, where he'd been wounded horribly and then captured and tortured, and his whole physical frame was, as a consequence, ruined. But he had a mind like a jewel, wonderful man. And he said, I will never forget, it was the day that de Gaulle took the franc back on the gold standard. Even you might not remember that.
I don't remember that.
With the extraordinary memory. Anyway, we turned up at the class, and Marcel said, "You've heard the news tonight about President de Gaulle. What do you think that this means?" And there was silence, and like a smart ass, I said, and I used to use phrases like this in those days, "Marcel, I think it might be a harbinger of the downfall of capitalism." And it was such an inelegant phrase, which is why I remember it. And there was a pause, and everybody was very, very kind to me. And Oliver Jones said, "Marcel, can I offer a view to our young friend," which is what I used to be called, unpatronizingly. "By all means, Oliver. Can I tell you about capitalism," which is how people of his generation used to pronounce the word. "Capitalism, as you'll find, is like a mountain stream. There it is, bubbling at the top of the hill. You can put a dam on it. You can, as we found to our great cost, build a housing estate on it. You can put clodges on it. You can do what you like to control it. And when you get to the bottom of the hill, there's the bugger coming out again." And he taught me a lesson about capitalism, which I've never forgotten. Anyway, sorry, that was all, by the way. So
you're one of the few people around, the few people I know anyway, who heard Nye Bevan speak as a boy. And the extraordinary combination of the thought, the flights of thought that would combine so many things with perfect timing, never over-prepared, the spontaneity of it, which you very rarely see in politics now. He didn't know where he was starting, where he was going to be in the middle or at the end until you heard him, did he? Capture for us what it was like to hear Nye.
Well, you said earlier in your kind introduction that Nye was a poet of politics, and he was, but a very practical poet of politics. And there was a third P, pragmatism. In order to achieve advance, he was always willing to be pragmatic. He spoke very dismissively of what he called so-called socialists who threatened to nationalize everything and end up nationalizing nothing. They are purists, and therefore, it's the most important word, and therefore barren. And he held them in total scorn, the ultra-left. But so he is this practical poet. And to listen to him, I think I must have been about 12 when my father took me to hear him. Indeed, I was 12. It was in the Suez Crisis. And the title of the meeting, which was also addressed by Michael Foot and Ian Mercado, in the Workmen's Hall in Tredegar, which was a theatre, a beautiful theatre, that sat 1,800 people, but when I spoke, there would be 2,200 more, because people were standing alongside, and it was broadcast by Tannoy outside in Morgan Street in Tredegar. And my father took me on the Sunday night, and we got there early, so we had a really great seat. And Nye spoke, and I can't pretend that at 12 years of age that I comprehended the issues. I mean, I read the News Chronicle religiously at home, or what I didn't read was read out to me, because I mean, it still goes on. It still happens in our house. I guess it happens everywhere. But anybody hitting a particular resonant sentence from James Cameron or other great writers of the time, oh, listen to this. And so you couldn't be but conscious, without anything being rammed down your throat, of the environment and times in which you were living. So that much I knew, but I didn't know the intricacies in the way that Bevan explained them. And it was hypnotic. It was funny. And what I came to recognize to be cadences and silences that spoke volumes and sentences that became long and really forceful so that they belted you at the end, and other sentences that were finished. Just let the imagination. And I never forget, I don't remember what quotation it was, but there was a quotation from the Bible, and there was a damn great chunk of what I thought was Shakespeare. But when I did my A-levels, I discovered it was from Christopher Marlowe and Dr. Faustus. And it was so resonant, and he never condescended to the audience. He never avoided using complicated words. And sometimes he would use it with an accent. Actually, he would say, and the audience there'd be a titter running through it, you know. I can give you an example. I can actually quote a speech. In the 1959 general election, and I died 2 years afterwards, I went down to Abergavenny, to the Monmouth constituency, to support the Labour candidate, Joe Richardson, of beloved memory. And I was 17, I'd never really encountered any Tories before in my whole life. I knew we had a baker living down the road from us who was a Tory, or said he was. But that's because he was a baker, and he had a car, and it was nothing to do with politics. Anyway, I went down, and I canvassed an absolutely new concept to me. I canvassed, together with some other youngsters from around South Wales, in support of Joe. And the Eve of Pole rally was to be addressed by an Irene who conventionally, since the 1930s, had gone to somewhere in the Monmouth constituency, Ascot, Abergavenny, to speak on behalf of the candidate. He spoke for Michael Foot when he was the candidate in 1936, I think it was. And so he came to speak for Joe. And then he would hare up Black Rock to the heads of the valleys and finish up in the Workmen's Hall in Tredegar. So my intention was to go to the Abergavenny meeting and then, in a friend's car, get up to Tredegar and listen to both. But I was drafted in as a bouncer, which was more convincing than it is now because I was an inveterate rugby player anyway, and they put me on the doors, and I was given the task of ushering Nye Bevan into the hall because I was from Tredegar. I don't know if they thought I'd speak his language or something, but this was Abergavenny. Anyway, the market hall in Abergavenny, and of course Nye is late. It's very late. And the poor old sod, the only Labour councillor in Abergavenny, a county councillor, was given the task of just keeping the meeting going. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever been there, Peter, but it is a dreadful, dreadful role. I think it must be worse than giving out the Academy Awards in Los Angeles, you know. Anyway, this old fellow was aspirantly embarrassed. In fact, he didn't have an H in the proper place in his whole vocabulary. So I was hover in the hall, meant I was over in the hall. Anyway, he trundled on, and in the front, there were 2 rows of young Tories drafted in by bus from Cardiff who gave him a hell of a time. And they were vile to him. It was dreadful. And he had no means of controlling it, and the chairman didn't want to put off the audience, absolutely packed out. And eventually, Nye turned up. He came in through the door behind me, and I turned around and I said, "I'll take you down now, Mr. Bevan." He said, no, let me get the smell. Let me get the smell. So after a minute or so, he heard all this heckling and booing and catcalling at this poor old county councillor, an old railwayman he was. And he said, "We'll go down now, boy." So I took him down, and he was observed coming down the aisle. The chair, with some relief, got up and said, "Comrades and friends, and Lady Bevan!" Tumultuous greeting, except, of course, from the young Tories. And I got on the stage and immediately took out one piece of paper from his pocket, which he always had. I never actually saw him looking at one, but nevertheless. And he leaned into the microphone and almost in a whisper, he said, "Comrades and friends, it's a great delight to be here with you on the eve of the victory." And the Tories tittered and other people mildly applauded. And he said, "I want to impart to you some news. The news is, I don't hate all Tories." And they did exactly what you just did. In fact, it's fair to say there are 1 or 2 of them I can even admire for their kindness to their children and their care for their wives and their resources. Another titter. So it can fairly be said, and his voice was slightly rising in volume, it can fairly be said that Nye Bevan is not a man who detests people just because they are conservatives. What I hate is snobs. End of story. And then he carried on with his speech. And that was just in 3 sentences, 4 sentences, he'd gone through, I don't know, Henry IV, Part 1. I mean, it was extraordinary. It was a great, great performance, but with real import, real force. And then he went on to make a wonderful speech.
We'll come on to Michael Foot in a minute, his great disciple and your great mentor. But the other influences on you in terms of your democratic socialism were reading R.H. Tawney, weren't they?
Yeah.
What was it that hit you between the eyes from Tawney? And what's relevant now?
Tawney's plain language. He was an extraordinarily gifted intellect. With the mark of all great intellects, he had the ability to be simple and to be deductive in a way that took you through his arguments. Anybody, literally anybody, could read, understand, and then I think sympathize with Tony. It's entirely relevant now. He wrote a great essay, We Mean Freedom. He wrote it in 1942 for the New Yorker. And it was in order to convince the United States that they'd done the right thing in December 1941 in joining the British and Commonwealth forces in resistance to the Nazis and the Japanese Empire, and they should have no doubt about it. And it was resonant, or resonance, not the right word. It reminded me, when I read it later, of Orwell's Lion and the Unicorn. Because here was really forceful, progressive patriotism, which Orwell used the term, patriots love their country, nationalists hate other countries. I think it's not a bad definition, especially when you come against the so-called alt-right and the far-right and the Nazis of today. They beat their chests for patriotism, but you know, it's detestation of others that is their main motive rather than love of country. And what Tony did in that essay was to convey the absolute quintessential argument for combating the Axis forces and everything that Nazism and fascism meant. It was wonderful stuff. It didn't prevent him from making the democratic socialist argument. In it, for instance, I mean, this is really up to date as to the last couple of days when we are getting a rehearsal or repeat yet again of the presentation of the market economy and capitalism as the savior of the world. The last refuge of an embarrassed conservative, in my view, but there you are. It being done in a didactic way that can't be expected to win the argument. And there are serious arguments in favor of the mixed market economy. There's no question about it at all. And many of the attributes claimed for it are absolutely true. But what Tony said was about arguments about the state. The state is an instrument, no more, no less. It is not an animate being. In stupid, greedy hands, it will be stupid and greedy. In enlightened and generous hands, it would be enlightened and generous. And when you think about it, and all the guff that surrounds philosophies and ideologies of the state, to cut through it like that. And then he goes on to say, of course, it's a very important instrument, which is why there's such a struggle to control it. And then he develops the argument into democracy. But the simplicity of that idea to sort of sit back and say, well, damn, I knew that, but I never recognized it in those terms. And that's the heartwarming thing about Bevan, about Orwell, about Tony, about some other people. Galbraith is another one, who you could read or hear and agree with because you'd always thought that, but you'd never had the words or the confidence or whatever else it took, the poetry, to produce that sentence in that way. I'd be so damn proud if I could produce a sentence that reduced the state to an instrument, no more, no less. And I didn't need convincing. I was already there for years before I read it. But to hear it with that simplicity and the power of that simplicity was wonderful. And that's why he's applicable now. That's a tiny, tiny, minuscule fragment of the genius of R.H. Toney. But if it induces anybody to go off and read Richard Toney, if you can get one of the books, then my mission will be served.
Absolutely. You linked him with George Orwell and the classic essay, Lion and the Unicorn.
Yeah.
written in the Blitz, published in 1941. When you were leader of the Labour Party, and we'll come to that in a minute as well, you said to a friend of mine, Richard Waite, after one of our seminars, historical seminars, that you thought every aspirant member of the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party should read it. Now, why should they? Why should today's shadow cabinet read it?
Apart from anything else, both in The Lion and the Unicorn, and earlier than that, in The Road to Wigan Pier, the second part of Road to Wigan Pier, which is a polemic. The first part is a telling report into poverty and inequality and injustice. The second part is Orwell's philosophy, and he might even have used the same phrase twice, but it's definitely in The Road to Wigan Pier, and I'm certain is in The Lion and the Unicorn. The cause of socialism, above all else, is liberty. That reality should ring like a clarion trumpet across the nations. Instead, it is too often buried by ideologues like a jewel in the dunghill. When I read that first, I was a kid when I read that first. And I thought, nobody will ever exceed that passion, that clarity, and the fact that the man lived by that code, exposed humbug and oppression, bigotry, and despotism, little tiny despotisms as well as great big global despotisms, and did it with mellifluously in ways that invited you to turn the page, a real inspiration.
Talking of inspirations, another great wordsmith, Michael Foot, who you revere, wonderful man. How important was Michael in motivating you to want to become an MP yourself?
I should say, incidentally, I never revered him because he would have scorned me if I did. I don't know if he had any part in motivating me. I was very, very fortunate because I was a constituent of his and active in Labour politics, student politics.
He took Nye's seat in 1960 after he died.
He was elected in the by-election,
Yeah.
having been excluded from the shortlist by the National Executive Committee. And I was the youth delegate to the Tredegar constituency party. And of course, all hell let loose when he was excluded. But on the list was Ron Evans, who was very highly regarded local councillor and had been Nye's agent since 1950. Ex-Chindit, steelworker, really great man. I mean, great man, Ron. And a huge Bevanite and admirer of Michael. And with great generosity, he got his group in the constituency to withhold their votes to endorse the National Executive Committee. No, let's have a real contest, said Nye. And I'd be privileged to go up against Michael Foot. Now, there are very few people in any walk of life, including politics, who would do that, but they did. And they wrote a furious letter to the National Executive Committee and said they were going to send a strong deputation up to the NEC in order to protest about the way in which the NEC had set aside the candidature of Michael Foot, duly nominated by miners' lodges and God knows what. Anyway, the NEC relented, or at least Gateskill relented. Michael was on the shortlist and got selected as the candidate, fought the by-election, got a very good majority and everything was fine. And obviously I was very active in the by-election. I met him only once during the by-election. And then subsequently, as a university student, we had a mutual friend, Bill Harry, the guy who recruited me at 14 years of age to the Labour Party, our local county councillor. And Glenys and I used to go walking with Michael on Sunday mornings on the hills around Tredegar and over to Abergwail, which he loved to do. And of course, I got to know him very well and got to be his friend as well as his adoring admirer. I make a frank confession of that. Not simply because of his greatness as a journalist or as a speaker, or as a parliamentarian or an internationalist, all those things, fine. But he was one of the most sensitive and kindly, courteous men. He's probably the most courteous man I've ever encountered. And I've known a few ladies and gents who deserve the title, but he was a wonderful character. And the idea, I think he would have sort of brushed it aside, make up your own mind if I'd raised the possibility of seeking a parliamentary seat. But in any case, it was such a distant prospect that until I graduated and got a job and Glenys and I got married and we'd settled down, it never really started to formulate as a possibility in my mind. And I don't think I ever talked to Michael about it, though Jill, his wife, Jill Craigie, beautiful woman, she would go on about it, and she might have talked to Michael about it, because she certainly talked to Glenys about it repeatedly, and also to me. You're the next, you're the next. And it would used to embarrass the hell out of me, as you can well imagine. And then the way in which, very accidentally, things fell my way. Meant that I became a candidate at, I was 27 years of age.
And you were elected in 1970.
Yeah.
Why did you never accept office in the Wilson or Callaghan governments, Neil? Because Michael, I'm sure, wanted you to. He was Deputy Prime Minister.
Oh, yes, he did. In the Wilson government, I had the kind of number 12 shirt. I was invited to second the Queen's speech, the Royal Address, when we managed not to lose the election in February 1974. And this was generally in being allocated to a young backbencher, a way of sending a message: the next vacancy in the government is yours. But I knew it wasn't going to be me, because Wilson, while in opposition, had sent me in his place, together with 3 other backbenchers, including his PPS, Charlie, and had sent us to Russia. He did an official invitation from Brezhnev to visit the Soviet Union, and hadn't been able to do it, but asked if he could send 4 youngsters instead, because Wilson had a mixture of fear and respect for the Soviet Union. The White Heat of Technology speech was actually all about this, that Russia would develop as such an economic and scientific power, such an industrial giant, that this was the contest we were going to have. Anyway, he retained that view, which I didn't think about, tell you the truth, and I'd always been very suspicious of the Soviet Union. I think it was Bevan who said it's the future waiting to be born. And when I got there for this fortnight visit, we decided beforehand that we would go, apart from Moscow, to new and rebuilt places. So we went to Novosibirsk and Akademgorodok in central Siberia, which was newly built. And, but we also went to what was then just becoming called Volgograd, Stalingrad, which had been 84% rebuilt, and to Leningrad, formerly and latterly St. Petersburg, which had been substantially rebuilt. And it was remarkable, but I came back and I wrote a memo, which I thought was my duty, to Wilson, saying, among other things, we really didn't have to worry too much about the rise of Russia as an industrial power, they literally couldn't make the lifts work. So how the hell they were ever going to aim an intercontinental ballistic missile accurately at this, I didn't know. And I was 25% joking, but 75% was what I thought was a serious critique of a system of oppression and incompetence where the stupidity was built in. And when we had a couple of KGB people with us who were patently very smart people, indeed brilliant people, but they would suppress their own thoughts manifestly in the course of a conversation. And I thought, bloody hell. Again, as Bevan said, that no industrial power has ever succeeded. Some have been achieved, but none have succeeded in the absence of popular democracy, which is still true, even when we observe China, is still true. And, that view I'd taken throughout, even before I'd read Bevan saying it. I knew in my gut that there was something wrong with that system. Anyway, this visit proved it, and I made the error, well, if it was an error, of writing to Wilson saying it, whereupon his enthusiasm for me as a coming young star diminished greatly. So I knew that regardless of seconding the Queen's speech and all the rest of it, or proposing the Queen's speech, that it wasn't going to happen. In any case, I swapped my position with a guy called Ray Carter, who was a very decent bloke, but was desperately disappointed by not being a junior minister. So I felt so sorry for him. We were in the Chief Whip's office in number 12, and I said, hey, Ray, would you like to move the speech? Oh, could I? He said, and I said, yeah, you do it instead of me, and I'll take you a place and I'll second it. So this is what we did. And the speaker, actually, it was
Selwyn Lloyd.
Selwyn, actually started to call Mr. Ray Carter. Anyway, Ray was very happy and was made a junior minister a few months later, and that's very good. But I knew I'd fallen out of favor. Jim was different. Jim had been a friend since I campaigned for him in the early 60s. Very, very hard. And Glenys, being the secretary of the Socialist Society in University College in Cardiff, there were 3,200 undergraduates there. 800 of them were members of the Socialist Society. So you can imagine the forces we could deploy on the street for Jim.
Yeah.
And we put up his majority from 700 to 7,000, and then to 12,000, and it was all. And Jim and I always had political differences, but we always got on. He's a really decent man, and very generous man. Anyway, he asked me if I would join the government when he became Prime Minister, and I had fundamental differences over the government's public expenditure policy, which I thought was utterly mistaken, and as the weeks were passing, with the policy for the kind of devolution that they were proposing. And I just said to Jim, I'm really sorry. I would like to serve you and the movement and all the rest of it, but it would be profoundly dishonest and inconsistent. And so, thanks, but no thanks. And the same thing happened about 10 months later, I think it was, when there was a reshuffle, and he asked me again, and I said, listen, we're even deeper in now, especially with the devolution arguments. And I said, my first obligation is to try and uphold the interests of my constituency, and it would directly contradict the loyalty I would have to give as a matter of honor to the government. So I didn't, and he was very understanding, he was very kind. He was brassed off, but he was very kind about it.
And then a few years later, we'll leap forward, you become leader of the Labour Party yourself. You're the only man I know who can date his midlife crisis to the hour. Do you want to explain?
Well, now here's a coincidence. Today's October the 3rd, yesterday was October the 2nd, and I became leader of the Labour Party about 5 o'clock on the afternoon of October the 2nd, 1983. So that was, 34 years ago, yesterday. And I can, as you say, I can date my midlife crisis precisely from then till 2 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday, the 18th of July, 1992.
When you ceased to be leader of the
When I
Labour.
ceased to be leader, yes.
You had a terribly tough first 2 years because it coincided with the miners' strike, flesh of your flesh, and yet the leadership of the miners' union was not your style of leadership. And then militant, the expulsion of militant. Now, I'm not sure we've got much time to go into all the detail of that.
Sorry, I've been talking too long.
No, not at all. But linking with where we are now, I have to be careful here as I'm a neutral sort of person. Do you think there's a destructive gene in the Labour Party?
Do with more neutrals like you. Sorry, that's ruined your career.
That's very kind. Do you think there's a destructive gene in the makeup of the Labour Party? I mean, Dennis Healey said to me once, years ago, there's a nice name drop, isn't it?
Yeah.
When we were talking about the Attlee government, which I'd just written a book on, that he reckoned that Labour had run out of things to do that everybody agreed upon once they'd implemented the Beveridge Report, which was pretty well coterminous with the 45-51 Labour governments. And thereafter, the propensity to fall out was going to be much higher. And when you think of your lifetime, there's been at least 3 great monumental fallings out, maybe 4. Do you think there's something in the Labour Party and the Labour movement that does lead to this?
I know what Dennis meant, especially as he observed the late 40s and through the 50s. And he was a young member of Parliament from 51, right in the middle of the crossfire, and of course was International Secretary of the party after leaving the forces. And I think he fought a seat and he got it to be a Tory marginal, but he didn't win. And then he won the seat in Leeds. So I understand why he would have been scarred in that way by the sheer fruitlessness, as he certainly would have seen it, of the incessant battles going on between Bevernites and Gateskiellites and left and right and so on in the Labour Party. But I think he would be wrong if he thought that it was because they'd accomplished so much and therefore lost their, pardon the phrase, momentum, because the great accomplishments, and in any case, they were absolutely whack-tired after the years of the Depression, the war, the immense burdens on them as a new government and all the rest of it. But I actually think that if Clem, and you are biographers, so you may profoundly disagree with this, if Clem hadn't been so whacked and fed up by 1950 with the way in which affairs were being conducted, not just by the Bevernites, but those who were trying to take action against them, and the way in which everybody treated things as a contest for every inch of ground and all the rest of it. If he hadn't been as wearied by that, he would have followed his instincts and possibly even have made Nye Foreign Secretary, or even maybe, I don't know, because Gateskill had the job, Chancellor, but certainly would have demonstrated respect for Nye's achievements in establishing the NHS and in being a great housing minister and accomplishing a great deal, as well as the adoration by a big chunk, not all by any means, of the party and some of the trade union movement. And if that had occurred, I think there would have been a quarrel between Bevan and some of the more zealous comrades, further to the left, or thinking they were further to the left, but it would have changed the center of gravity. It would have moved the center lines of the battlefield, and could have been destructive, but I think it less likely to have been destructive. So I think that I totally understand Dennis's sentiment and indeed his insight, but I think it's more that there is a grub in this this lovely flower of democratic socialism with all its ideals and its principles and its enlightened purposes and its extrovert attitude to politics and its internationalism and all the other reasons that I'm a democratic socialist. And the grub is, or maybe two grubs. One is there always have been, there always will be people in the Labour Party who cherish the idea of power in the Labour Party more than power for the Labour Party. And I've had some terrible rows with them. And then, secondly, there is the grub which is in all political parties, in the very nature of political parties, both in democracies and outside democracies, of clans, tribes, clashing personalities that have got very little often to do with ideology and a hell of a lot to do with aspiration or self-praise or ego. I saw Boris Johnson speaking today, and I thought, by God, if ego was air, it would have suffocated the whole bloody conference. But anyway, and you've got those grubs, and from time to time, when there's a source of irritation, they can really be a destructive force in the Labour Party. And it actually requires a terrific distraction of time and effort to suppress it, put it back in its box, and get the movement to focus on our purpose for being in politics, which is to change our society and, if we can, the world for the better. And there's no superior purpose. And there's no other instrument in the United Kingdom than the Labour Party for doing that. And if you can get people to remember that and to diminish and confine those grubs, those instincts, then the Labour Party sails on and is a real force. But when they distract or dominate, and it's much the same thing actually, then by God, convincing the British people that their country should be put in our hands is additionally difficult. I've got the T-shirt.
You have. You've got the T-shirt. Before we open out, can you give us quickly your assessment of the ecology of the current Labour Party and Labour movement?
Without aid of microscope.
Exactly.
Well, can I approach it in this way? I haven't really thought about it. In politics and in other walks of life too, especially in what I will call other creative activities, timing has a lot to do with success. And in politics, usually for decades, what people active in politics do is to try to identify the public sentiment of hope, expectation, aspiration, disappointment, resentment, concern, worry, whatever really is the predominant tendency in the public. And you can try to measure it with opinion polls and God knows what. But often, as the opinion polls have shown, there's something undefinable about it. But you just hope you can identify it, articulate it, put the argument that will enable people to identify with you, and then you have an election and you've got a better chance of winning. That's usually what is happening. The search for the understanding of the developing and prevailing public mood. Sometimes on the basis that even the stop clock is right twice a day. Sometimes the tendency, the sentiment, the feeling comes towards a political inclination. I think that's what's happening now, and that's why I think it not inconceivable that Labour could win the next general election and Jeremy Corbyn could be the Prime Minister. It isn't that the mood was so much identified and articulated and mobilized and is rewarded by votes. It is that this feeling that exists in our country now has been developing for some years. I wouldn't put a specific date on it, but it's around about 2008 for a mixture of reasons, not just the crash, reasons that go back before that. And this tide has been, maybe that's the best analogy, this tide has been gathering pace out in the ocean and is coming towards the beach. And it just so happens that Jeremy is there on the beach when the tide washes up. Now, I'm not saying he's had nothing to do with it or anything like that. A terrific election campaign was fought, and the result demonstrates that. And he's greatly assisted by the extraordinary, contemptuous indolence of the Conservative campaign. It was amazing, just astounding. So he's assisted by that, but that isn't the whole reason either. And that's where we are. Now, one last point I'll make, because I've talked too long. To gain an understanding of this tide, which is now reflected in wider society, but at least in the Labour Party, which I know fairly well, I knew it was there and developing from 2010. And the reason I knew it was there is I'd go around doing fundraisers and speaking at Labour Party dinners and various other meetings. And, you know, people were very kind to an old war horse. And sometimes I knew that what I'd managed to engender was some laughter and a feeling that we could overcome. And the extraordinary thing was, wherever I went, north or south, east or west, with predominantly working class party membership or university dons or a couple of doctors, the odd solicitor, a few priests on occasions, a real mixture. It didn't matter what the background or the location, people would come up to me and say afterwards, Neil, we haven't heard it like that for a long time. Now, okay, even cutting 40% of all that out for being nice to an old dog, it was coming up so often. And I would say to Ed that this phenomenon existed. People were getting so outraged by the way in which the coalition government was conducting affairs, not just with its incompetence, but its terrible arrogance, the idea that they were masters of the universe, and seeing the injustices and waste and loss of opportunities and pressures developing around them. And they wanted that outrage reflected not in flailing arms and shouting and stamping, but with a much more acrid presentation of Labour politics and the attack on an argument against Cameron and the Tories and to some extent the Liberals. And it wasn't coming, so that the moment Jeremy Corbyn got on that ballot paper, by this extraordinary series of accidents, and the electorate had been transformed by Ed's decision to have £3 membership, I put the two together and I said to Glenys the next day, Corbyn will get it. And she said, oh, I don't think so. I mean, he's a nice enough chap. And I said, no, he's going to get it, because that's the feeling there. And I don't even know what the £3 members feel, but I do know what existing members feel. And thus it turned out, 49% of people who had joined the Labour Party well before that leadership election voted as their first preference for Jeremy Corbyn. So I knew that was there, and I knew that tide was ready to break over the reef. And with the increasing insecurity in our society, the anxieties that come, the crisis in lack of housing, the price of rented accommodation, the insecurity of employment with this terrific irony of more people employed than ever before, but in more lousy jobs than have been in for a very, very long time. All those things coming together, failing to be addressed, I thought, when Theresa May made her Downing Street speech, and also when she made her conference speech this time last year. I thought, wait a minute, we're going to get a kind of Joe Chamberlain, Harold Macmillan, we understand, noblesse oblige, we serve the nation, kind of Toryism, and maybe she'll mean some of it. I doubt it, but maybe she will. And then I thought, she's a steady sort of woman. Yeah, she's stubborn, she's inflexible, but sometimes that's a real source of strength. So, whoa, she could be serious. Then, a couple of days later, she appointed Liam Fox and Boris Johnson, and I thought, oh, bloody hell. That hope was gone.
I think it's time for questions and discussion. Thank you, Neil. Can the lights come up? And the microphones, I'm sure, are distributed. And can we keep the questions nice and terse so we can get in as many as possible? No
keep the answers even terser. Sorry.
Hand up there, in the front row of the gallery.
Neil, good to see you again. I'm surprised that you didn't speak more about Europe. And I am actually a German Corbyn supporter. I've voted for him twice. But I think he's wrong about Europe. How do we convince the British population that we should not leave?
Okay. Thanks very much. First time round, patently, we either lost the argument or didn't put it with sufficient force because the majority voted to leave. What they voted beyond that for...
No,
Well,
please.
exactly. No, I agree with all that analysis.
Yeah.
And we know it would have been transformed if we'd had the vote for 16-year-olds and lots of other things. But the fact is, we are faced by the result. Well, there's not a word that adequately describes my feelings of concern about it. Not just disappointment, that's much too superficial. Deep concern. Obviously not about my generation so much as about, or even my children's generation, but my grandchildren's generation. I think it is an awful outcome. But we are faced with it. And whether we didn't put it hard enough or just lost the argument on the day, it's there. So the first thing to do is to concentrate on the practicality. The practicality is that if we have anything other than a substantial transition to ease this gigantic change in the way in which everything, not just the economy, everything is conducted after 44 years of engagement in the European Union, it will be an unmitigated disaster, which will severely further weaken our economy, which has currently got a balance of trade deficit, a balance of payments deficit, a gigantic borrowing requirement, a massive national debt, certainly by peacetime standards, a productivity deficit, a living standards deficit, a public services deficit, and all those weaknesses will be exacerbated by crashing out. And so we have got to secure a transitional arrangement and period which will enable two things to occur. The first and most obvious is the readjustment of so much in our economy, from our ability to check imports and exports so that we can provide proof of origin, even without tariffs, that it will impose huge costs and enormous bureaucratic obligations on a generation. And from that simple practical requirement right through to flows of investment and medium and long-term investment decisions and the employment that goes with them and the training and skills that go with them and so on, everything, everything. Now, if we can't get that transition or they don't try to get that transition, I fear even more for the future because that will also then deprive us of the other opportunity provided by transition, and that is the opportunity, and I'm measuring my words, for reconsideration, not of an objective of taking back control, so-called, but what the implications of this change, fundamental, profound change of relationship is with our nearest neighbors, by far our biggest trading customers, by far our biggest source of imports and inputs. And unless and until people get the chance, accustomed to the day-to-day bread and butter realities of the prospect of coming out of the European Union, the single market, the customs union, I don't really think that there's full comprehension, not because of stupidity, but because of the sheer dimension of the change, that there are sufficient people yet who comprehend the consequences of the action that they might have taken for attached but not directly linked in reasons. Some of them delusions, but I don't think many people suffered too much from that. Even the 350 million pounds a week mythologically going to be allocated to the National Health Service. But to give a chance, because of the size and longevity of the effects of this decision, to reflect, and if they need to take at some future stage a different democratic view of what occurred. Now, I would like to be able to give you a much simpler answer, a much more direct answer, a much more compelling, dramatic answer, but I'd be treating you like a fool, and I would be speaking as a fool if I said that there was a simple way to deal with this. There isn't. But there is a way, provided that we seek to ensure a way of sliding at the most gradual rate into a changed relationship, because the alternative is so appalling, and in the course of that, giving people another opportunity to examine what it implies for themselves, their families, their community, the future of their young, all of which should be the dictating realities on which a democracy takes a decision.
Can I see him? Right at the back. Right at the back. That's right there. Yes, you've got a good voice, but the microphone's coming anyway.
Versus a member of the Labour Party, Neil, I'd like to say thank you on behalf of all of us for your service to the Labour Party. My question is about momentum and what you see as the destiny of momentum in the modern Labour Party. You have to deal with militant. I believe that they are very different things, but the destiny, what is it? Where do you see it within the Labour Party, and how do you see it influencing its future?
Thanks very much. And thanks for your kind remarks. I think that we've probably, and I say this about commentators as well, moved past the stage where people were prepared to confuse momentum with militant. Actually, as a sentiment, as a movement, they've never been militant, although there are people who are significant in momentum who are not unassociated with the background of ultra-leftism and sectarian politics in the Labour Party. And they may have a disproportionate effect upon the direction of affairs in momentum, but they are not momentum. They don't make up the whole numbers. what they and a few others have managed to do is to capture a moment in which they could give the impression, in some cases sincere, that this was an open house for ideas and enthusiasm, and happily, a lot of young people were attracted by that, especially young people, but not exclusively young people, were attracted by that in the absence of apparent answers or exciting prospects. And I don't mean that superficially, I mean the chance to change the world, which doesn't only apply to young minds, it applies to some old fogies like myself as well, which accounts for a lot of new Labour Party membership, including those who've also joined Momentum. Now that's, I think, much nearer the dimension of it than the idea that they're all enterists and they're all trained in Liverpool and they all demand the nationalisation of the commanding heights of the economy and all the rest of it. That was never true, certainly of the whole outfit, although it would be true of some of those who have a significant part to play in it. Now, how can it be dealt with? Well, part of the answer is time and experience. And I don't want to sound like an oldie. I'm not talking about years and years and years. Oh, you'll grow up, you'll get to know much more. When you're my age, you'll understand. No, I'm not saying any of that stuff. I am saying that as people become active in politics and have to confront the dilemmas and determine the priorities in their political thinking, they will realize that the struggle that they have is much greater than they thought it was. That's the realization that comes to you, and it can come to you as a very early age. You don't have to be in your 30s and carrying around a mortgage and God knows what to come to that realization. All you've got to do is to look around the world, recognize the inefficiencies and the injustices, and understand that if there was a simple answer to overthrow these appalling burdens on our society and many others, it would have been done. And you're going to have to be a damn sight cleverer and more persuasive in making your argument to a broader and broader spectrum of opinion in our democracy in order to secure the mandate that will give you the power to begin to try and change things, building on what's been achieved before. Now, simply being engaged actively in politics, knocking doors, trying to persuade voters to vote and to vote in the way that you want them to is a very formative experience, and people learn fast. So the more contact, the more acquaintance, the more experience the people who are enthused about momentum have, if they really are serious about securing political power for the Labour Party by democratic means, and they want to advance their society themselves, their communities, they will learn that lesson very, very fast indeed. The problem is there's a bit of a distraction. This last conference, for instance, we witnessed a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of people expressing what could be dismissed as wild ideas and God knows what. And that doesn't disturb me at all. That's the tumult of politics. That's the cauldron. And some of it is very sophisticated and convincing. Some of it is very crude and discouraging. But that's democratic politics, fine. What really depressed me was the amount of time, effort, energy put into securing mechanistic changes intended to install one set of opinions in control of the Labour Party. Now, it really disappointed me, not simply because I disagree with them, but because it is such a phenomenal waste of time, energy, effort and idealism to spend time on doing all that. And I say this as someone who got a reputation of being a bit of a Stalinist, largely because I inherited a very undisciplined Labour Party. Not the whole lot, not even the majority, but undisciplined people who paid much more attention to their own passing opinions than to the serious business of trying to secure votes and get elected to power. And so, consequently, we had to become much more formalized than I ideally would have wanted in order to re-establish the seriousness of the Labour Party and win respect. And to a certain extent, we did, and it provided a foundation from which we could advance. Now, even doing that, there always had to be room, as long as people were operating within very generous, very liberal, small L, rules in this Democratic Socialist Party, for them to say and think and do what they like, as long as they stayed within the rules. I think we're in danger of moving at least a bit beyond that. So there are people who want only conformity with a particular disposition. Now, I don't think it's too late to pull back from that. I don't think that that is the guaranteed fate of the Labour Party. I do say that if that is the tendency which transcends or comes to dominate the conduct of the party, it'll never dominate the membership. We don't have proprietors. It's the mistake people make. We have leaders who are elected. We don't have proprietors in the Labour Party. And so it's very important for those who believe that they can ensconce a particular attitude by getting mechanistic control of various institutions and bodies and committees and whatnot in the Labour Party to disengage themselves from that preoccupation and get on with the business of developing policies that are persuasive and attractive and can secure the breadth of opinion. I'm not saying the two are mutually exclusive. You need a well-run party. You need organization. That is certainly the case. But never let the organization impede the appeal. Let it facilitate the appeal. And as long as people who've recently joined the Labour Party or long-term members of the Labour Party understand that, our welfare is guaranteed and our strength will develop further. If they do forget it, they'll be stabbing themselves in the chest and letting down millions in the process.
Neil, it's nearly drinks time, but can I ask you one final thought?
For my throat, you understand?
Your throat's giving up. There are a number of young political historians in this audience. How would you like them to remember you in their books in the coming decades?
As a 6'2", quite muscular, permanently young, as a democratic socialist, somebody who believed and believes, and always will, that the major political and economic decisions that determine human society, or the condition of human society, should be consistent with the well-being of human society. And in my view, that can only be achieved and maintained by accountable pluralistic democracy, which is why I'm a democratic socialist. It's this emphasis on society that produced the word socialism in the first place until not so much Marx, but Marxists came behind it and tried to pretend that it was scientific and anybody who's done O-level physics knows that it's not scientific. But that's what I believe, that's what I continue to believe. And somebody of my background, and I hope my understanding, didn't find it difficult to comprehend the reality that if there was a socialism and a capitalism, and I had to choose between the isms, I was part of a society and understood it, and as it turned out, wanted to serve it, whereas I had absolutely no capital, and there was no chance of me being one of those ists. And looking at the well-being of society, I think that democratic bodies and democratically motivated people who invest their effort and their imagination in trying to produce a better society will use capital for its best purpose, and that's generating wealth for the breadth of humanity, rather than hoarding it, taking it out of one hole in the ground and putting it in another hole in the ground, and just taking some pickings in between. And people could think of that as simplistic, but you can torture yourselves in trying to provide definitions of your own purpose. I don't think you can do better than to decide whether you want society, your community, the rest of humanity to flourish, or whether you want it to be subject to accident and fate. I know what my logical choice is.
Neil, thank you very much.
Yes.
Two of you.
Thank you.
Very good.